Welcome to Evidence Based, a new Harbinger psychology podcast. I'm your host, Cassie Stossel. On today's episode, we're talking about healing emotional eating for trauma survivors. Our guest is Diane Petrella, author of Healing Emotional Eating for Trauma Survivors. Diane is a licensed independent clinical social worker specializing in childhood trauma and emotional eating. Early in her nearly 40-year career, she co-developed the first child sexual abuse treatment program in Rhode Island. She has a private psychotherapy practice in Providence, Rhode Island. You can find out more about Diane at www.dianepetrella.com. Hi, Diane. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Cassie. I'm delighted to be here.
This is such an important topic, so I'm really glad we're talking about it today. And I thought we could start off just by talking about why is turning to food after childhood trauma so common?
Well, when you think about it, food is one of our first experiences of love. And, a child comes into the world pretty soon after. They're going to start drinking milk from the mother's breast and then maybe a bottle as well. But it's one of the first ways we experience safety, security. That first sensation a child would experience of pain would be hunger, unless there's something medically going on with them. So being held is part of that, and the security and warmth they may feel, and perhaps the look in their parent or caretaker's eyes. But that first experience of love comes with food for the most part. The emotional experience people have is very deep and rooted in that kind of visceral place of wanting to feel safe and protected. So that's part of it. And when you think about food, unless a family is really experiencing severe food insecurity, food is something a child, if they start using food for comfort, well, it generally is comfort too, obviously, in non-traumatic situations. But food is an easy to go to, self-soothing. I don't even like to use the word substance, but I guess you could say that, because you don't need a lot of money to get it, and it certainly may be readily available at home. There might be a candy drawer or, chips or cookies or whatnot in a pantry. And kids may not need a whole lot of money to go to, a corner store to buy some
Mhm.
candy, unlike things that may cost more money or an ID, when they're underage. So it's accessible and it's generally readily available. And they may discover, if for those people who use food to soothe themselves in childhood, they've discovered that this helps me feel better in some ways. It numbs a feeling that they may not even know how to understand or abstractly describe, but they can learn that pretty early on, that food helps them cope and simply sometimes get through the day.
Yeah, and I love in your book you talk about emotional hunger, and I read your book sort of after my journey with cancer, which involved a feeding tube. So
Mm,
I was not eating anything by mouth for about
wow.
4 months, and I really understood this emotional hunger.
Wow.
But I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about the difference between that and actual physical hunger.
Yeah, sure. Well, emotional hunger it's fueled by an emotional overwhelm. It's fueled by some kind of emotional pain and the related sensations or associated sensations in our body, because
Mhm.
pain is also physiological, a sinking feeling in the gut, tension, fear, panic. But there are some specific differences between emotional eating and eating for simply satisfying a physical hunger. So, as I said, emotional eating comes from a response to our feelings and trauma based sensations in the body, as I mentioned, anxiety or deep loneliness and sadness. Physical hunger is simply because your body needs food and it's letting you know that through the various ways our body tells us that. Emotional eating tends to come on suddenly, whereas physical hunger generally emerges gradually. If you think back of when you've had a meal, you're probably not going to be hungry for a little while, but you could have just had a meal and something troubling happens and you have the urge to eat something. It's not necessarily because you're physically hungry, but you may be emotionally hungry on a certain level. And with emotional eating, you may tend to crave certain foods, certain comfort foods, or what's sometimes called trigger foods. Generally, those are high fat, salty, sweet kinds of things. And other kinds of foods won't satisfy that emotional hunger, say carrots or a salad. And obviously, nothing wrong with those things, but it's not going to solve it in the same way. But if you're physically hungry, anything will do. You're just physically hungry and your body needs something. Those carrot sticks are going to taste really good if you're physically hungry and need something. With emotional hunger, you're not as attuned to your body's physical signs of fullness. You may keep eating because you're not eating to assuage the physical hunger in your body or to soothe that. You're eating because there's that emotional feeling. So you're not going to be as attuned or attentive to or listen to your body's physiological needs. When you eat for physical reasons only, you'll stop when you're full. And another thing with emotional eating, people generally, after a period of emotional eating, there may be a lot of self judgment. They may feel a sense of shame or guilt. When you're eating to satisfy physical hunger only, you generally don't feel that way. So, those are some of those main differences.
Do you find that when people are sort of in the midst of that emotional hunger that they're self-aware that that's what's driving it? Or do you find that like that sort of logical piece of your brain shuts off and it's just like about consuming?
That's a good question, and it really depends. Some people, like you said, that'll just shut off, and it's just around a mindless eating to feel better, to emotionally feel better. Other people may be very aware of what they're doing, but their thoughts are not going to translate in a change in their behavior. They're just feeling too overwhelmed. They may be judging themselves as they're eating, but they're not necessarily going to be able to stop that.
Yeah, and I think in general, I mean, setting trauma aside, I think us as a society, we've sort of forgotten how to tap into our natural hunger cues and fullness cues, but how can someone start to do this when we haven't been doing it for so long?
Mhm. I suggest you first start by consciously tuning into your body. And for people listening right now, if you take a moment, get quiet, eyes open or closed, tune in. What are you experiencing in your body? You're feeling a sense of physical satisfaction that maybe you ate a little while ago and your body feels okay. Do you notice a gnawing sensation in your stomach because you haven't eaten in a while and you're starting to get hungry? Do you feel stuffed? Did you eat too much? And your body, and you're feeling kind of sluggish or overly full. Maybe your clothes feel a little tight. So simply start paying attention. One of the things I suggest is make a point perhaps of one day, or if you want to do 2 to 3 or 4 days, and consciously tune into your body 3 or 4 times a day. Maybe set like a set time, maybe 9 o'clock, noon, 4, 7, but away from meal times. And just say, okay, every day, or just for today, I'm going to tune in and listen to what my body's communicating to me. So just consciously taking steps to develop awareness by paying attention.
Yeah, that's important. I think a lot of us are just so disconnected from our bodies. So
Mhm.
that simple act of tuning in can be really powerful. What are some ways that you suggest soothing anxiety without turning to food?
One of the easiest things to do, and one of the things I really love teaching my clients about, we all know this, using our breath, but we know it and don't always tune into it. What I love about breathing exercises is our breath is always there for us, it's always with us. No one has to know what we're doing. So, the first thing I'd suggest is for people to learn what's called diaphragmatic breathing. And people may be familiar with the term belly breathing or abdominal breathing. People may learn it in yoga, for example, but it's when you're taking deeper breaths so that your lungs get the full benefit of how calming breathing can be for our bodies. One physical sign of anxiety is when we're taking shorter, shallower breaths. So when you're feeling some anxiety, when you can learn diaphragmatic breathing, and if you think of a bellows, as a bellows brings air in, your belly and the diaphragm is a large muscle under the rib cage. And as you're breathing in, that expands. And as the with a bellows, it's expelling air, your stomach will contract. And one way to learn this is to put one hand on the upper part of your chest, another hand on your abdomen, and just breathe naturally. And notice which hand is moving more than the other hand. Both may move. Sometimes one may move more than the other. If you notice the upper hand is moving more, chances are you're taking in more of those shallow breaths. And so consciously, when I first learned this a long time ago, it felt unnatural to breathe diaphragmatically. I had to teach myself how to do this. But once babies are generally born breathing this way. When you see babies in a crib, their little bellies are going up and down. So teaching yourself diaphragmatic breathing is a very simple, easy, self-calming process to use. And there are lots of different breathing exercises. One I like is called either four-step breathing or box breathing. I believe it's taught to in the military, Navy SEALs, because it's so effective. So that you breathe in to the count. I usually say the count of four. I've seen sometimes people will say longer, but that might be too much for some people. Start with four, but you're breathing in, 2, 3, 4. Hold a breath for 4 counts. 2, 3, 4. Exhale, 2, 3, 4. Hold a breath, 2, 3, 4. So if you do that several rounds, if you can remember to do it, and I also want to add, many people may forget to do that. That's okay. It's just a practice, just to, I could have done that. I didn't. I'll try it another time. No beating yourself up, because I may suggest lots of different things to do, but it takes time to incorporate those. So that's one simple thing people can do, is tune in to your breathing. And even if it doesn't take anxiety away 100%, and it may not, that's okay. If it brings it down to 80%, to a little more manageable degree, it may help you be more mindful of what your next step will be. And with anxiety, the other thing I want to add is that breathing is great, but it's also important to, when you can, move your body, because of how anxiety stays in our body and the tension around that. If you can take a walk, great. If you can't, do something physical. If you're at home, sweep the floor or wash a sink. Doing anything physical can help as well. Addressing one's feelings, soothing one's feelings, is to create what I call a self-care basket. Could be a box, could be a basket, but where you put in this basket different items that have been useful in the past to help you when you're either feeling anxious or some other overwhelming emotion. So it's a go-to resource. It could be filled with those fidgets, these kinds of things you can, like a squeeze ball or whatnot, to use for a few moments to kind of release some anxiety. It could be handiwork. I'm a knitter. I love knitting. It is so incredibly relaxing. Or needlepoint. You could have something like that in your basket. A box of herbal teas. Could be a playlist of music to listen to. But different things that have helped in the past when you're feeling either anxious or overwhelmed in some other way. So it's always available. You don't have to think about it. Just go to the basket and see what jumps out at you that may be able to work in that moment.
I really like that, having that accessible, because in the moment when you're
Mm,
super anxious, you're probably not
right.
thinking about what can I go to cope, like, so that takes that guesswork out of it.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you, like, kind of what you're talking about, going for a walk or pulling out your knitting. Why is it so important to connect with your body? And what does it
Mm.
look like to have that supportive relationship with your body?
Well, when you think about it, our body is our home. I like to see it that we are spiritual beings living a physical experience in a physical body. And our emotions, it's the container for our emotions. So when we're disconnected from our bodies, in some ways we're disconnected from ourselves. So it makes life and our choices easier when we're attuned with what we're feeling emotionally, when we're attuned with physical sensations, as we talked about earlier, of hunger, fullness, thirst, also pain in our body that we can pay attention to and not avoid. I like to think of my body as my best friend. And treat it that way as a best friend or as a child that's entrusted to my care. But it's how we're experiencing our world, whether with if we whether through sight, sound, all the sensations, movement. It's our vehicle and makes life easier and more fulfilling and rich when we can feel connected with that vehicle in a loving and affectionate way.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Just a little bit of a personal experience. I felt so disconnected from my body
Mm,
during cancer treatments. Like,
yeah,
you're not only not recognizing your body, you're feeling sort of those areas where it feels like there was a deficit that got you to that point. And so
yeah.
it's so interesting. Now I'm on the other side of it in remission
Oh,
and
good.
trying to sort of relearn my body and have a new appreciation for what it went through to get me better. But that disconnection was not like anything I had ever experienced before
Mm.
with my body. Like, it was just so strange. It was like such a weird feeling, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know if this applies to you, but many people, when they're dealing with a serious illness, may feel as if their body is betraying them.
Yeah.
That that's not an uncommon feeling either. That's so hard to deal with.
Yeah, so I can see already how powerful it is reconnecting with my body and
Yeah,
sort of turning that thought process of, well, this body gave me cancer versus this body got me through healing. And so, like,
exactly.
consciously trying to shift that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
In your book, you talk about fear-based beliefs and feelings. Can you talk about what those are and what are some common ones that come up for people who use food to cope?
hmm Well, those fear based or limiting beliefs that we have, it's our inner critic, those chastising, self denigrating, self critical thoughts in our head. Whether someone was traumatized or not, there will be there.
Mhm.
When someone's been traumatized, and especially if trauma was abuse, and especially if that was abuse by the very people that was supposed to take care of you, those beliefs may be beliefs of feeling unworthy, unlovable, undeserving. There may be a sense of feeling easily ashamed. Something's wrong with me. I'm damaged goods. When it comes to emotional eating, it may be that this is too hard to change, or I'll never stop being able to turn to food. So there are those limiting beliefs or fear-based beliefs are rooted in the pain of early trauma, and it's that constant or almost constant self-criticism that can be hard to shut down. Those voices are loud, and those beliefs sometimes can be so unconscious we're not even aware of when we're being led by them. Like, I'm not worthy, so it may hold you back from wanting to try something, and you may not even be aware that you're feeling that way. You're just aware that you're not going to pursue something, for example, and they can hold people back, or maybe a fear of disappointing people, maybe a fear of upsetting people, um, fear of abandonment, etc.
So, especially when some of those are maybe unconscious, like you're saying, how can we start to heal those fear-based beliefs?
I talk about a process that I developed in my book, a process I developed. I call it you're creating your sacred vessel. One way of addressing fear based beliefs, just start with what you're aware of, first of all. And those subconscious ones the more you begin to be aware of what's motivating your behavior, and when you begin to be curious about that and self reflective, and just start asking, well, gee, what held me back? Some of those deeper fears that might be subconscious will start coming to the surface little by little. One way of addressing those fears is a cognitive behavioral therapy approach of writing them down. It's good to take them out of your mind and body and put them on paper. I also want to say that's not always easy to do. If somebody is in a process of therapy or with a good friend, someone they feel comfortable with, sometimes it can feel easier to do them with the support of somebody. Even writing them down may feel hard, not always, but it could. What I talk about in my book with this sacred vessel approach adds to cognitive behavioral therapy, because when you're only looking at And addressing thoughts from your cognition, I feel it's not necessarily enough. It's needing to be with those feelings in a safe way and bringing love to them. I work with clients. I bring in, it's a spiritually inclusive approach. So, depending on what somebody's spiritual or religious beliefs are, I will bring that in. I talk about our wise self, which is our intuitive knowing, our inner wisdom, because our answers are inside of us, but we're not always attuned to that. So, with this process, for example, so you write down what your the limiting belief is and write down a more empowering reframe. It has to be a reframe that's believable. So if you feel unworthy, it's not going to feel believable to say I feel worthy, but you may be able to say, even though I've felt this way for a long time, doesn't mean I'll continue to feel this way. It's just a thought I keep thinking. And one thing I say to my clients, and I don't know where I read this, but I love it. Don't believe everything you think. We can't believe everything we think because many of those thoughts and beliefs came from a time and place where we had no choice over things in our lives and hard things that may have happened to us, and then how that filtered into our self-perception. It may have been somebody else's belief that got put on a child and it's been carried into adulthood. So, in any event, this process is about identifying limiting and negative beliefs, limiting beliefs, trauma based beliefs, writing down a more positive and believable reframe so that you have that available. And I talk about getting a container. Again, it can be a beautiful basket or a vase of some sort with a lid, and you put those limiting beliefs inside. And then you take a love energy. By love energy, I mean, what's another a symbol that you could use to put into this container? I've had clients where they cut up pieces of pretty ribbon. That was their love energy. I had a client who cut up fabric that I think it was her grandmother used to sew, and she had some old fabric. So she cut pieces of that, reminded her of her loving grandmother. So she would put that in. It could also be pretty stones or crystals. So you put your negative, the limiting beliefs in the container, and you call forth your higher power, your wise self, and you ask that wiser part of you to hold those fear-based beliefs with love and in their loving embrace. And then you just start little by little. When those fears rear their heads and you're overwhelmed, to be mindful with that feeling, but you could use that as a container of being with those limiting beliefs. You don't have to push them away. They were there from a long time ago, but add love to them. And then remind yourself of that more uplifting and believable reframe. But you're not alone with those feelings. Your higher power, your wise self is there with you. And imagine all those limiting beliefs being held in the arms of divine love. So it's a mindfulness technique to be with feelings that calls forth that wiser, loving part of all of us that we have. So it's not only a cognitive exercise.
And I love what you're doing with that of, externalizing that. Like, I love that you're
Exactly.
taking those beliefs out of the person because that's sort of metaphorical that you're not your thoughts because they are separate from you. So I think that's a really cool exercise to do to really just take it out of here and put, I'm pointing at my head.
That's right. But that is exactly what it is. I talk about those inner beliefs. It's in our subconscious, not even subconscious, but fear-based beliefs, limiting beliefs. They're inside of us. Our subconscious is like a container, conscious and subconscious, holding those beliefs. So you take it out, gives you some space, and you're honoring them. Most of those beliefs are there to protect us from something, and it's each person's journey to find out what it uniquely means to them. I'll use this simple example. If you don't fear putting your hand on a hot stove, you're going to burn yourself.
Yeah.
So if you're afraid of disappointing people and you're become appeasing and people pleasing. Well, maybe earlier in your life when people were disappointed, they hurt you. But it's important to honor that most of all of these thoughts came from a place of wanting to serve and protect us. And now we can say, but I don't need you this way anymore. I don't need you at all anymore, or I don't need you in this way, these ways anymore. But thank you. Thank you for having tried to protect me, having protected me.
Yeah, I really love that way of looking at it too, because that takes away sort of that self-blame that people might experience,
Right.
that shame in how I am or just how I am out of it. It's just like that was something you needed at the time and now you don't need it anymore.
Exactly. Exactly.
So what are some common feelings that people with childhood trauma experience and how can mindfulness help?
Some common feelings of trauma, and specifically trauma that was abuse, because obviously there's a continuum of trauma. On the one hand, there may be people who experienced childhood physical, sexual, or emotional abuse by the people who were supposed to take care of them. That level of relational trauma is very, very hard to deal with. Then there may be divorce, where parents aren't abusing or hurting their child, but the experience of divorce can be traumatic. Or there's a death in the family, or a parent may have a mental illness or an addiction, and there may not be abuse, so it's certainly traumatic in its own way. And then there may be on the other end of the continuum something that happened to a child in school or by non family members. And perhaps nobody either knew about it because the child was afraid to tell. Certainly with sexual abuse, that's not unusual. But there may be other kinds of things that, for whatever reason, a child didn't want to share. So that the secrecy around that can be traumatic. But I point that out because there's a range of emotions and some common feelings, particularly of early abuse, and some of this overlaps with other kinds of trauma, would be feelings of worthlessness, that damaged goods that I had mentioned earlier, especially when you're harmed by people in your family, or a sense of shame, worthlessness, guilt. Whatever happened was my fault. Why didn't I do something to stop it? There may be a level of trauma based deep loneliness. And loneliness doesn't mean there aren't a lot of people in someone's life. That level of deep loneliness and emotional emptiness comes from not having someone to share the truth about your experiences, even when there may be a lot of people in your life, and even when there may be many loving people in your life. That's where secrecy around certain kinds of trauma or certain kinds of experiences can be traumatic in and of itself. There's what happened to somebody, a child or teen, and then not talking about it adds another level of trauma and another level of emotional isolation. There may be anger and rage, again, on another level of continuum. Rage may be more aggressiveness with how somebody may act out their anger. There can be some of that with anger as well. Rage is just on the more extreme form of that, but a default feeling of anger and rage is not an unusual trauma based feeling. Also, a sense of helplessness. There's that term learned helplessness. Children and teens, when there's chaotic or dysfunctional or traumatic things happening, and they have no power to change that. Certainly, children don't. Teens, a little bit more when they have a little more autonomy and either can leave a home or tell somebody what's going on or run away. But that sense of helplessness that there's nothing I can do to change this, and that then leads to hopelessness, almost like an emotional collapse. There's nothing I can do to change this. It can later in life lead to passivity, not initiating behaviors to try to improve or change one's life. Sense of chronic sadness may come from childhood trauma. There may be some happiness, of course, but the default might be one of low level sadness, perhaps interpreted as a level of depression too, fear, anxiety, episodic or chronic panic states. Those are some common feelings that children experience that without support or help may move into adulthood as well. And you talked about how mindfulness can help. While it's hard to be with some of those feelings, and people, when you have a hard time being with some of those hard feelings, you want to do something about it to just push it away. And that's where food comes into play for those who are struggling with emotional eating as their predominant way of coping. There could be other ways as well. But mindfulness is being able to get to a place, and this may be easier said than done, but it's not impossible. And I just want to say that because people may try to do this and feel that I can't, I feel like I'm crawling out of my skin. How can I be with this feeling? It's just something to imagine seeing, getting to a place where it's easier to do this, and it's practice, but you're simply being with a feeling without having to push it away with food or anything else. And being with a feeling without pushing it away, doesn't mean you're just sitting with the feeling and not trying to comfort yourself. It's, as I talked about, that self care basket. It's comforting yourself in ways that are soothing the feeling. Think of a baby who's crying. What does the baby need? They need to be held, they need to be fed, maybe they need to be changed. So, what is the feeling calling forth from you? What can you do to comfort yourself with it and be with it that way, rather than pushing it away where you're numbing it, distracting yourself from feeling it and understanding what you can learn behind it, numbing yourself with it and not really learning from it. And it's not only about, it certainly is learning from those emotions, but it's trusting that you and your body can handle physiologically whatever the associated feeling is by just being there with it and comforting yourself in the best way you can. It's also a way of helping you feel connected with your body too, and connected really with yourself. And when we're connected with our feelings and we really know what we're feeling and we're not afraid of those feelings, when we know ourselves in those ways, it helps us make more empowered choices in our lives too. Just helps make our life work.
We'll be right back after this short break.
Hi, I'm Dr. Daniel Fox, author of the Borderline Personality Disorder Workbook. When you first are diagnosed with BPD, or you're first told that you may have borderline personality disorder, it can be very frightening and overwhelming because we have these ideas of what this disorder is, and you can feel trapped within it, trapped within this view or perspective of this thing that feels bigger than you and bigger than life. But the reality is that this is a disorder that can be managed, and that learning adaptive strategies can help you control it and do your life differently so that you determine the course of your life, not your BPD. To learn more and to sign up, go to bpdcourse.com.
In your book, you talk about a 4-step process to go through those emotions and feelings mindfully. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So I'll first go through them all and then I'll elaborate a little bit. One is to notice the feeling, then name the feeling, accept the feeling, and love the feeling. So I realize when people are learning something like this, they think, you may not think, okay, wait a minute, what's the step one? What's step two? What's step three? After a while, I mean, really what I'm talking about are things that will naturally evolve for people as they move on a path of emotional recovery. So it's just breaking them down. But notice the feeling is about just recognizing your feeling. Say somebody has the thought to grab something to eat. They know they're not really hungry, or they may not even know that, but perhaps they just ate, but they have an urge to eat something. Do the best you can to pause. Notice, what is this? Am I really hungry, or am I feeling something? What am I feeling? Ask yourself, what am I feeling? And where is it located in my body? What is my body feeling right now? Is there a sinking feeling in my stomach? Do I feel tense? Am I feeling sort of hot with anxiety or panic? Notice as best you can And where is it in your body? As I said, our bodies are the container for our emotions. So notice and do the best you can to locate it. Then name it. And that may be hard to do. In my book, I have a list of feelings by 4 categories. It's sometimes easy to think of feelings grouped as sad, mad, glad, or scared. But within that, just like with, there are primary colors, but the world is so much richer when you see the palette of all the different reds and all the different blues. And so the same with feeling. Notice what you're feeling. And sometimes it's easy to take out a sheet of paper, look at all these different ways that you may be feeling sad, all the different ways you may feel angry or mad, all the glad, mad, sad, or scared, and identify and say it out loud. So you're bringing in the thinking part of your brain. There's something that, even in a slight sense, can feel almost grounding and comforting to say, I feel sad. Think of a child who has an attentive grown up in their life who says, Susie, you look sad. What's wrong? Or Susie, you sound mad, that you're naming it. And when we do that for ourselves, it can be just as supportive and reassuring and grounding, even in a slight way. So simply saying it and just naming it and saying it out loud can help. And then the third part of that step would be accept the feeling. Now, that doesn't mean it's not hard to be with it, perhaps, but it's saying to yourself, I feel, for example, sad, and that's okay. That simple phrase, I feel mad, and that's okay. Or I feel lonely, and that's okay. The okay is simply an acknowledgement that it's okay to feel whatever you feel. Again, the example of a child, to be heard. Oh, I know you're sad. That's okay. Here, let's talk about it. It's so reassuring, and we can give that reassurance to ourselves. So that's accepting it. I want to add about shame. Shame is a tough emotion to sit with. And, I'm going to go back to guilt and shame. I'm going to elaborate to something I talked about earlier. Sometimes people confuse those. One way of thinking about it is guilt basically is I feel upset about something I did, or, I did something wrong, I did something bad. Shame signifies I am wrong or I am bad. It's more of a reflection of how someone feels about themselves and who they are, not necessarily about a behavior. And shame is a tough emotion to sit with. And a lot of children who experience childhood trauma that's abuse may live with that and carry that into adulthood. So it may be hard to think of saying, I feel shame and that's okay. But what I say is, you could say something like, it's okay, I feel this way. It's an old feeling I carry inside, and it's not the truth of who I am. And that's a way to give yourself some space. I'm feeling ashamed right now. Breathe. It's an old feeling I carry inside, and it's not the truth of who I am. Then the last part of that 4th step is love the feeling. As I mentioned earlier, in the same way a crying baby needs affection and support and tenderness, what can you do to love the feeling? And that's where that self-care basket that I talked about earlier comes into play. So you don't have to think about it. You go through the basket. What do I need now? Do I need to calm this feeling? Do I need to soothe the feeling? Do I need to ground myself and maybe do something physical? So there are different feelings may require something different, and taking time to create a self-care basket can help with that.
Yeah, and part of that process that you talked about too was sort of taking that pause. Why
Mhm.
why is the why is there power in the pause?
I love this part. Well, it's always useful for us to pause before reacting, to pause before talking. Lots of us, don't do this on a regular basis, myself included. But when we can pause and reflect with whatever it is, we're going to be more mindfully, responding to a friend in a conversation, more mindfully responding to our own feelings, more mindfully reacting to whatever the situation is. When we can be more mindful and take time, we're less likely to do something impulsive in a way that might backfire on us or hurt somebody else. Years ago, I read a wonderful book called My Stroke of Insight by Jill Bolte Taylor, who's a brain scientist, a neuroanatomist. And she talks about a stroke that she experienced when she was fairly young, I believe in her 30s. It's a fabulous book. She has a fabulous TED talk about it. But it was through her, that I learned what she calls I believe she calls it the 90-second rule. So that when we're triggered, triggered to feel anxiety or anxious, our neurology, our physiology is activated, and the stress hormones get activated and start coursing through our body. And physiologically, according to this 90-second rule, it only takes about 90 seconds for those stress chemicals to move through our body and be released or to get neutralized in our body. But what happens most of the time? We keep the stress response active with the thoughts that we have. So perhaps somebody's triggered by being yelled at or called out by their boss. They're mortified. They may be angry. They start feeling, their body tenses up. They may start looking for food, go to the office lunchroom or whatnot. And they may be thinking, I can't believe he or she or they did this to me. I'm so mortified. How in the world could why would he have said something like this? And oh, I'm so terrible. And I may lose my job, and all the fears that may come from being called out by one's boss. So the 90 seconds is going to keep adding. Each thought will add 90 seconds more anxiety or stress hormones activated through our body because we're not giving our body time to rest. When you're armed with, as I call being armed with this 90-second rule, I think offers a kind of hopefulness that if I can get myself to neutral, if I can get myself out of my thoughts and let my body rest, I won't feel as overwhelmed emotionally and physiologically. It's really tough to deal with the physiological ways in which our body gets activated. You feel, as I said, like you're crawling out of your skin sometimes. And it's hard to be with and stay with your body when it's like that. So when you can do a breathing exercise, as I talked about before, that's really useful. Knowing that, just calming it a little bit. And again, this is something I do with my clients too. Just focus on one thing and breathe for about a minute and a half. And that one thing could be like this sounds funny, but that's why it's sometimes useful, your right big toe. Just focus on that with your eyes open or closed, depending on where you are or how comfortable you are. And just let a minute and a half go by. Or focus on while you're looking at the clock. Just looking at if you have a clock with a second hand like that. But do what you can with different breathing exercises, focusing your mind on one thought or an image around you to help your body, after 90 seconds, get back to a place of what I would call neutral. So you're a little less activated by those stress hormones. And sometimes that little bit of space is enough to make a more mindful choice about how you want to deal with whatever it was that triggered you.
Yeah, and speaking of triggers, how can someone identify their trigger foods and what do they need to think about when deciding whether to include or avoid those foods within their daily life?
Okay. I think of trigger foods as foods that are simply hard to stop eating once you start, whether you're physically hungry or not. And they may be hard to even stop starting to eat. If something's around and it feels like a trigger food for you, it may be hard not to eat it. Again, even if you're not hungry. Trigger foods generally are, as I mentioned earlier, foods that are high fat, salty, sugar, kinds of foods that people have come to discover helps them feel soothed or grounded or a distraction from emotions. So for some people, it may be chips, it may be cookies and baked goods, it may be a kind of candy or chocolate, it may be pasta or bread. Everyone's different when it comes to what might be a trigger food. And there's a similarity between perhaps a trigger food or foods that are comforting, but I do think it's different. You may want to have a comfort food, but it's not triggering necessarily in the same way, although it can be. But there are a lot of foods that are comfort foods that don't necessarily lead people to emotionally eat with them. There are different ways of looking at how to deal with those kinds of foods. I very anti-diet. I think diet culture has created a lot of havoc on people's relationship with food and their bodies. And it's important to, as I said, quote, legalize all foods. That's a concept that I believe became popular in the 80s and whatnot, and obviously important to still be attentive to today. That it's not about foods that are good or bad, although I when I say that, I have to underscore that we all know that there are some foods that are going to more enhance our body and others that aren't, like some highly processed foods and things the food industry does to get us to buy certain foods that, that's another discussion. So what we eat doesn't need to be judged. And I think it's important to pay attention to what our body needs for it to be vibrant and healthy. So if somebody's aware of what certain trigger foods may be, it's about deciding, you can legalize it, yet still legalize it in your mind, yet choose not to bring it into your home. Some people aren't going to want to have certain foods because they may feel too tempted to eat them, and that's not necessarily going to cause, quote unquote, that sense of deprivation some people may feel. So if someone chooses not to bring certain foods into their home, maybe they choose to have them if they're out at a restaurant or a party. But if you choose not to bring, for example, potato chips home or certain kinds of candies or cakes or cookies, will that feeling of emotional deprivation be triggered? And if so, how confident do you feel in your ability to soothe or comfort yourself if that feeling comes up? I'm going to digress here for just a moment because that feeling of deprivation, I know a lot of professionals talk about, well, you don't want to feel deprived. I bristle a little bit when I hear that because real deprivation is not having food to eat.
Mm-hmm.
I try to help my clients, and I hope readers, I address this in my book, that rethink that word deprivation when it comes from food, because really it's rooted in emotional deprivation in childhood that's been attached to food. There are many people who can't eat certain foods because their bodies are going to rebel.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you have celiac disease, or if you have, if you're lactose intolerant, there are certain foods that if you eat them, it's not just simply not going to be healthy for your body. And many people will choose, okay, I'm not going to do that. They're not feeling deprived
Right.
by not eating them. So I want to say that because I do disagree a little bit with that idea of you can legalize all foods, yet still choose to not have some. And it doesn't mean you're going to feel deprived because of it.
Yeah.
So it's really rethinking. So, how will you handle it if you choose to bring some of those foods home, if family members want to bring it home? And how do you believe keeping trigger foods out of your home will be helpful to you? So just ask yourself some of those questions. People who do this tend to look at not so much that they can't eat these foods, but they're choosing not to.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of feeling that they're denying themselves, they feel that they're taking good care of themselves. So I really invite people to rethink that whole concept of I will feel deprived if I don't eat certain foods. And if you choose to allow those trigger foods into your home, will you be able to mindfully satisfy a desire or craving with a reasonable portion? And if so, what helps you feel comfortable you'll be able to do this? If you do feel triggered to emotionally eat these foods when you're stressed, how confident will you feel in your ability to not judge yourself and let it be okay?
Mm-hmm.
And how do you believe keeping these foods in your home will be helpful to you? So it's really about choice and having the freedom to decide what works best for each person.
So in your book, you have a chapter toward the end called Create an Emotionally Safe Sanctuary. What does that look like?
I love this chapter. And I'm so glad it was in my book because it's not your typical psychotherapy approach. It's not your typical self growth approach. But over 20 years ago, I read a book called Clear Your Clutter with Feng Shui by Karen Kingston, and it transformed my life. And I will say, I've also had almost 2 decades of therapy at that point, or 15 years at that point, and that transformed my life too. So, what I call working in therapy and dealing with emotions and beliefs is healing from the inside out. As we change our thoughts and beliefs, we're healing from those from our inner world to create external change. What this book taught me is how we can create change from the outside in, because everything in our home, in our physical world, the things that we choose to have around us, has an energy attached to it. Everything is energy. Our thoughts and beliefs have an energy. The physical objects around us have an energy. And when I began to learn just how powerful, it's like these, think of energetic strings attached to all our belongings in our home, the items in a briefcase or a purse, the things in our car. When you start to declutter, and I don't mean decluttering just for, which is really important, but only to have a more ordered home life, which is, it's very, as anybody who's cleaned out a drawer or a room knows, you feel a sense of relief. It is stressful to have a lot of stuff around us. It reduces that chaotic feeling when we can clean something. And I talk about, I think of decluttering as like self-growth's best kept secret, because fairly easy. I know it's not always that simple to declutter a lot of things, but I talk about looking at our belongings with new eyes, especially objects from our past, from a time in our lives that may have been painful or traumatic, childhood, adolescence, perhaps earlier relationships that might have been painful. For example, one thing, and I did this myself, I used to write and journal all the time. And in my earlier life, my 20s and 30s, oh my goodness, my journals were filled with pain of difficult relationships and all sorts of pain. After I learned about the power of clutter clearing, I literally had a fireplace in my condo I had. I burned them. And it was almost palpable. I read them through. I honored who I was at the time, where I was at the time emotionally, and how journaling helped me. I said, I don't need this pain in my life anymore. I didn't realize that as long as I had those journals in my home, that pain was still there on an energetic level,
Mhm.
affecting me in ways I really had no idea about. There may be other items from childhood that people have been given and they're still, or that they took from childhood. I have some examples. Say you have your childhood plates and dishes, but mealtime wasn't a happy time. Get rid of them. Little by little, bring new ones in. It's about, everybody's world is different, the objects that they have. And also, what are you posting on social media? Stop sharing things that are shaming, body shaming, shaming in any kind of way. Just be careful about what you're sharing, what you're posting, and stop belittling your, in this, emotional eating challenges or any challenge.
Mhm.
There are lots of funny jokes about using food and you only live one. I don't know.
Yeah.
There are all sorts of different things. Stop doing that. Clear out your feeds too. And look at everything you own, including the words and the objects and your things online, as having an energy. What is that energy saying about who I am and who I want to be? So it's a chapter that is healing from the outside in and can have really powerful results, and that I consider can accelerate a healing process truly in ways that are pretty magical.
Yeah, I really understand the power of this. My husband and I, after I was declared in remission, we did something very similar with everything that we had acquired over the months, all the medicine,
Oh,
all the equipment, and we just donated what we could. We recycled
yeah.
what we could, and it felt so good to just purge that piece of our lives.
Yes,
And I hadn't realized how having it around was such a reminder. And so I totally understand that.
exactly. It really is powerful. It's really powerful.
Yeah. And as we start to wrap up here, Diane, in your experience, what are the qualities that a successful person has in this healing journey?
One thing is self responsibility. Taking responsibility for yourself and your challenges, not blaming other people. They made me feel such and such, or I was so upset because of what they said. And, blaming other people doesn't help. Constantly criticizing yourself, but just taking ownership
Hmm.
of ways in which you may have been harmful to somebody else, ways in which you may be having, being self critical of yourself, kind of taking a step back and just owning that. But just self responsibility and letting go or doing the best one can to little by little go of blaming others and blaming oneself. Commitment to a consistent practice. And by that, I mean doing the best you can to do something every day that enhances your sense of self love and giving to yourself in some way. And, every day, I don't like rules about that. Every day means every day that you can.
Hmm.
One simple thing to ask oneself when it comes to emotional eating and improving one's relationship with one's body. And there's an audio exercise that people can download when they get the links to that in my book. And it's about connecting with your body. One simple question to ask, to tune in, get quiet, to ask your body, what do you need from me today so that you can feel loved and well cared for? Simply even asking that and then letting go. You may hear an answer, you may not. But what's one thing you can do every day that is in support of your own self growth and of your body? Patience. Patience is so important. Change takes time, and sometimes it takes a lot of time. And it's not on our time frame.
Hmm.
Self growth and healing is a process, and there isn't necessarily a set finish line, although people can always move forward. When impatience starts to come into one's mind and they're saying, well, what's the point? I'm still emotionally eating. What's the point of all of this? I say, stop, say to yourself, wait a minute, I'm the point. I am the point. And even if it's taking longer than I want it to, that's okay. Change takes time. And perseverance. I think of perseverance as, trust in action. You're trusting that you're moving forward in your life, you're moving forward in your healing journey, even when you see evidence that what you think is to the contrary. It's at those times in particular that our perseverance needs to step up. That even though I feel like I'm not making progress, today is a new day. I can choose to think differently today. It's trust in action, even when you're not always seeing the kinds of results that you would like. And I think if we talked about self compassion, really being able to go through this journey with being gentle with yourself and compassionate through your struggles.
Yeah, I think that's a great place for us to wrap up, Diane, unless you have any final thoughts for the listeners.
I just like to underscore that emotional eating is not your fault. It's not about a lack of willpower or it's not about anything being wrong with you. Emotional eating behavior makes sense in the context of what your early experiences may have been. You're just trying to feel better, and that's a good thing. Emotional eating for many children who are in difficult and dysfunctional and traumatic childhoods, it is resourceful. It helps you survive, and that's something you can honor. I don't call emotional eating a disorder. That's not a word I use. Even as a
Hmm.
therapist, I don't use that with my clients. You're using food to soothe yourself. Now, how can I help people learn, when I work with clients, let's look at some other things you can do in addition to emotional eating so that little by little you're adding more things and you're healing, and emotional eating will lessen and lessen over time. And I'd like to say be forgiving of yourself, but there's nothing to forgive. If you're using food to soothe yourself, that's not a sin. You don't need to forgive yourself for that. Just be gentle, have self compassion, and trust that you're doing the best you can, and that's okay.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Diane. Thank you for your work on this really important topic and approaching it with such compassion. And I just really appreciate this conversation.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been delightful to be here. Thank you very much.
Heal the trauma at the root of your emotional eating. If you've experienced physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, your past trauma could affect how you care for yourself today. You may struggle with difficult thoughts and feelings and reach for food to soothe your emotions when feeling sad, anxious, or stressed. You aren't alone. In fact, studies show that there is a strong link between adversity, trauma, and abuse and emotional eating. The good news is that there are tools you can use to heal from the past and nurture a healthier relationship with food, your body, and yourself. This book offers step-by-step guidance for rewiring your brain to calm trauma-based fears, regulate your body and emotions, connect with your inner wisdom for strength, and release emotional weight. Healing Emotional Eating for Trauma Survivors offers an innovative, trauma-informed approach to overcoming emotional eating using the principles of mindfulness, self-compassion, and neuroscience. With this gentle guide, you'll gain a deeper understanding of your trauma and discover alternative ways to soothe stress and difficult emotions when they show up. You'll also learn to shift your focus away from your weight so you can cultivate a more loving connection with your body as you heal. With this compassionate guide, you'll discover ways to calm your anxious brain and body, safely process your emotions, transform self-punishment into self-compassion, practice self-forgiveness and overcome body shame, take your power back from trigger foods, create an emotionally safe sanctuary with friends, family, and home. Most importantly, you'll find the support you need to end the cycle of emotional eating and release the weight of your trauma so that you can live with a greater sense of freedom and vitality. Visit our website at www.newharbinger.com and use coupon code podcast25 to receive 25% off your entire order. New Harbinger Publications is an independent, employee-owned publisher of books on psychology, health, spirituality, and personal growth. For over 50 years, our evidence-based self-help books and pioneering workbooks have helped readers make positive changes to improve mental health and well-being. Founded by psychologists Matthew McKay and Patrick Fanning, New Harbinger is proud to be an employee-owned company. Our books reflect our core values of integrity, sustainability, compassion, and trust. Written by leaders in the field and recommended by therapists worldwide, New Harbinger books are practical, accessible, and provide real tools for real change. The best continuing education training does more than just fulfill requirements. It opens your mind to new possibilities, increases your confidence, and gives you powerful tools to transform your clients' lives. Praxis Continuing Education and Training partners with world-class experts to create cutting-edge, evidence-based courses for mental and behavioral health professionals. Learn how to heal trauma with Robin Walzer, explore values with Kelly Wilson, and master the basics of acceptance and commitment therapy with Matt Boone through an on-demand course. Or join experts and like-minded professionals live to take your practice to a new level. Find your next training opportunity at praxiscet.com. That's praxiscet.com. Do you have an idea for another episode? Do you want to send us a message? Our email address is podcast@newharbinger.com. We'd love to hear from you. This podcast was edited by Jesse Fancushion. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love if you rated, reviewed, and subscribed to the show, and we hope that you might share it with anyone who could benefit from the content. This podcast is not a substitute for counseling with a licensed provider.